Snow fell in thin, whispering veils, settling over the crooked roof of the Hensley cabin, clinging to the warped boards like a shroud. The wind hissed through the chinks, rattling the loose shutters as though the house itself groaned from hunger and cold. Clara Mae Hensley pressed forward through the drifts with a sack of flour clutched against her chest, her bare fingers reddened, nails cracked. 3 small figures trailed behind her, Rosalie, June, and little Lydia, moving as if the storm were another weight laid upon their tiny backs. Clara's breath fogged in the air, each exhale a prayer unsaid. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and desperation. Silas Hensley, her husband, sat hunched at the table, a bottle in hand, his face carved with bitterness that no drink could thaw. He looked up when she entered, eyes narrowing at the sight of flour that had been bought on credit. "More debts," he spat. His words cut sharper than the wind outside. When she said nothing, when she only lowered her eyes and tried to warm the children near the fire, his fury erupted. His hand struck her cheek with a crack that echoed against the hollow walls. The girls froze, Rosalie's small fists clenched at her sides, June's wide eyes brimming with tears, Lydia too young to understand but startled into silence. Clara bent her head, not from weakness but from necessity, gathering her children close as though her body could shield them from the blows of the world. Silas called her cursed, said she'd given him nothing but girls, no heir to carry his name. The shame in his voice was heavy enough to fill the room, and Clara bore it quietly, her silence a wall against which his cruelty crashed again and again. The town whispered the same refrain. At the well, women spoke in lowered voices, 3 daughters, what use is that? At the church, Reverend Crow thundered about fruitful unions, and Clara felt each word land like a stone. Even Miss Temperance at the dry goods store let her tongue wag, telling any who'd listened that Clara was bad luck, a burden on her man. Clara heard it all, carried it in silence, and then, at night, when her girls pressed close to her, she let her voice slip into song. Soft, trembling hymns that turned pain into lullabies. "Why don't folks like us, Mama?" Rosalie once asked, her eyes full of questions too heavy for a child. Clara stroked her hair, whispering, "Because we carry light they cannot see." June listened with solemn attention, Lydia's thumb tucked into her mouth as her small eyes fluttered closed. In those moments, Clara's bruises seemed less important than the fragile hope she poured into their ears. Winter deepened, and hunger sharpened its claws. Clara mended their threadbare dresses by the fire, her needle moving steady even as her fingers ached from the cold. The girls read from an old tattered Bible by firelight, their voices halting but eager, and Clara felt a faint pride take root. She did not have much, but she could give them this, the rhythm of words, the echo of dignity. It was at the well that Sheriff Elias Boone first paused long enough to see her. A widower, known for his quiet ways, Boone carried grief like dust on his boots, no louder, no smaller, simply part of him. He stood tall, shoulders broad beneath his worn coat, hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much and said too little. Clara avoided his gaze, hiding the bruises beneath her shawl, but when she raised her eyes for a breath of a second, his were waiting there. He did not ask questions, did not pity her. He tipped his hat. The gesture was small, but in its simplicity it granted her a measure of dignity no one else had bothered to give. The town noticed, of course. They always did. "Boone's looking at the cursed woman," someone whispered at the mercantile. Gossip curled through the streets like smoke, poisonous and quick. Yet Boone seemed untouched by it. One afternoon, Clara, children in tow, stumbled at the edge of the boardwalk when Silas barked at her to hurry. The apples she had purchased rolled across the planks. Elias bent down and lifted one into Rosalie's hand. His voice was low, steady, almost tender. "Hold it tight. Don't let the cold steal it." Then he stepped away, as though nothing had passed between them. But Rosalie's eyes lingered on him long after. Silas's cruelty grew sharper as the winter did. Nights were often broken by shouting, by the slamming of doors as he stormed off to drown himself in whiskey. Clara would remain, rocking Lydia, whispering comfort to June, trying to teach Rosalie not to harden her heart too young. Hunger gnawed at them until even pride tasted thin. Then, one morning after a night without food, Clara found something at the door. A small bundle of wood. A loaf of bread wrapped in paper. No name, no knock, just warmth and sustenance waiting in the snow. She clutched it to her chest, tears spilling silently as her girls clapped their hands in delight. She knew it was him. She felt it in the quiet generosity, in the way it was left without demand or witness. She baked the bread, watching her daughters devour each slice with wide-eyed joy, and for the first time in many months she wept not from pain but from gratitude. The days that followed pressed heavy upon her shoulders, but now there was a spark in her chest she had not felt before. Perhaps the world was not wholly against her. Perhaps one soul, carved from grief, had chosen to see her as more than cursed. Snow still fell, the cold still pressed against the windows, Silas's rage still smoldered, but in the hush of a winter night, as she tucked her daughters beneath patched quilts, Clara found herself whispering a new prayer. Not for deliverance, but for strength to endure, because the faintest ember of hope had been placed in her keeping. And hope, once set alight, is hard to put out. Silas found the bread and wood stacked near the hearth, and suspicion burned hotter than the fire. His eyes narrowed, and the corners of his mouth curled into a sneer. "So that's how you keep us fed," he growled, the words dripping with venom. "Selling your shame to some fool with pity in his eyes." Clara stood still, her breath shallow, her hands trembling at her sides, but she did not answer. The girls huddled close to her skirts, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff with the memory of blows. Silas seized Clara by the wrist and dragged her out into the bitter night, shoving her into the street while neighbors peered from behind half-drawn curtains. The snow swallowed her gasp, the cold biting into her lungs as he struck her across the mouth. Miss Temperance Wilkes whispered from the stoop of her shop, shaking her head as though the sight confirmed what she already believed. "Ruins what she brings," she muttered, her words trailing like smoke in the wind. The Reverend Crow, passing by, pursed his lips and looked away. The silence of the town cut deeper than the blow, for not one voice rose to defend her. But Elias Boone was there, standing at the edge of the boardwalk, his shadow stretching across the snow. He did not stride forward with guns drawn or fists clenched. Instead, he stepped into the street with the slow certainty of a man who had nothing left to fear. His voice, low and steady, carried through the winter air. "Enough, Silas. She's carried more weight than you ever could." The words hung there, quiet but unshakable, like stones dropped into still water. Silas barked a laugh, loud and bitter. "A widower with no legacy. What weight do you know of, Boone? A man's name dies with him if he's got no son. All you've got is grief to pass down." His eyes glinted with cruelty, sure of the crowd's approval, but something in the hush of the onlookers shifted. No one laughed. No one nodded. The weight of Boone's words had unsettled the soil beneath their feet. Clara fell to her knees in the snow, clutching little Lydia against her chest. Rosalie reached out, her hand trembling toward Elias as though he were the only steady thing in a world gone harsh. Boone bent, not toward Silas, but toward the children, wrapping his coat around their shivering bodies. His hand rested lightly on Rosalie's shoulder, a gesture both protective and unassuming. That small act carried more defiance than any shouted threat. The town saw it, and though no one spoke, the silence was no longer one of agreement but of reckoning. Rosalie's voice, thin and uncertain, broke through as she looked up at her mother. "Mama, he made us warm without saying a word." Clara's throat tightened, her breath catching in the space between pain and revelation. Her daughters, who had only ever seen men's anger, had been given a glimpse of something else, quiet strength, a gentleness that carried more power than fists. The night passed heavy, but the air in town was different come morning. Silas stormed through the saloon, boasting of how he had put his woman in her place. He slammed his fist on the counter, daring anyone to contradict him. But men's eyes shifted away, not from fear, but from weariness. Elias entered with his steady stride, the door swinging shut behind him. He carried no weapon in hand, only the gravity of his presence. The saloon fell into silence, the only sound the crackle of the stove in the corner. Boone spoke without raising his voice. "If the measure of a man is the sons he sires, then I'm no man. But if the measure of a man is how he raises what the Lord gives him, then I'll raise these girls proud." His words cut through the room like a blade honed on truth. Miss Temperance, standing by the stove, gasped. Reverend Crow sputtered, his sermon notes scattering from his hand. Tobias Finch, the stable hand, gave a small nod, his gaze fixed firmly on Boone. Silas's face turned crimson, his pride cracking under the weight of words he could not twist. He lunged across the saloon, fist swinging, but before it landed, two townsmen stepped forward. They weren't Boone's friends, not even men known for courage, but they had heard enough. Rough hands caught Silas by the shoulders, dragging him back, their silence now a refusal to stand with him. His curses rang out, but they sounded hollow, like echoes in an empty canyon. Clara, standing in the doorway with her children pressed close, watched as the tide turned. Her heart pounded, fear and awe tangling until she scarcely knew which was which. Elias did not look at her then. His eyes stayed on Silas, steady and calm. It was not triumph that shone there, but resolve, the kind that does not seek victory but justice. The snow melted slowly in the weeks that followed, though the chill still clung to the mornings. Clara found herself walking not with her eyes on the ground, but lifted enough to see the horizon. She carried scars still, but they no longer marked her as weak. They had become proof of survival, reminders that even the most fragile-seeming branch can bear the weight of snow until spring comes. Elias took her and the girls to his homestead, not with a proclamation of love, but with quiet offers, a place by the fire, fields where children could run, fences to mend side by side. Rosalie rode her first horse under his watchful eye, June learned to plant seeds in straight rows, Lydia toddled through the grass with laughter spilling from her lips. Clara watched them, her chest aching with a strange new fullness. It was not the life she had dreamed of as a girl, but it was a life stitched together with threads of dignity, warmth, and the promise of peace. Elias never spoke of love, not in grand words, but it showed in the way he patched a tear in Rosalie's dress, in how he handed Clara the reins without hesitation, in the steady presence that filled the quiet evenings. Each act was a declaration more lasting than any vow. The old soul's voice returns here, soft as wind through prairie grass. The winter was cruel, yes, but in its cruelty it revealed who carried fire within them. Clara Mae was no longer just the woman beaten for birthing girls. She was a mother whose daughters would walk with heads high because one man had dared to see worth where others saw shame. And if ever you find yourself called cursed, remember this: the measure of your soul is not in what the world demands of you, but in the love you choose to raise from what you are given. If these Wild West tales stir something in your heart, ride along with us, subscribe, and let these fireside stories keep warming your nights.